Someone said, oh, we thought it was half an hour earlier. So we did it an hour ago. We're doing this again. And so I had a good dry run. So maybe you'll all be the beneficiary of that in terms of an even smoother presentation. What I'll do is I'll give it another 30 seconds or so, just for any late people coming on, and then we'll get into the talk itself. I was told that this is more of a lunchtime learning kind of webinar, so I'm keeping it fairly light. I plan to go through the material in about 20 minutes. And after that, we can leave it open for any questions and discussion that people want on top of that. And of course, it's going to be recorded if people want to listen to this again later on. So I thought to cover topics in optical networking. Optical networking is, of course, an area dear and near to ECI's heart. This is one of the strengths of our particular sort of solutions that we bring to our customers. And certainly, it's a large part of the solutions that we bring to the NREN community, which we're presenting to today. Optical networking, of course, is extremely important in terms of being the foundation of our global internet economy. It provides what I call is the basis for providing virtually free communications, certainly compared to what the situation was decades ago. And the fact that we can talk to anyone, anywhere, anytime, or download gobs of movies or play interactive games, again, virtually for free. And this is really due to the fact that we can engineer these fiber optic networks where photons flow very freely down pieces of glass, and that we can use technologies such as EDFAs and other kinds of amplification to light and excite those photons independently of the information they're carrying, which means that we can support many different wavelengths, carry many different services, all simultaneously on these pieces of optical fiber. And what we're trying to explore today is taking these optical networks and seeing just in a few particular areas how we can make them even work better for us. So the areas that we're going to be going into is optical encryption, and talking about some innovations in optical encryption, that we can start to move this from the wavelength layer actually to the in-service layer. And then on a different subject entirely, talking about how we can monitor the health of our optical network and why this is important and what are some of the things that we can do about it. So optical encryption. So it starts with the premise that fiber underlies the bulk of your communications. Certainly that would be the case in all the NREN networks that are being engineered. They all have a very strong fiber optic base, which is providing the basis for the packet communications. And you might think just because it's light, it's sort of a lot more difficult to tap into a fiber than to put an alligator clip onto a piece of wire. But that's not really the case. Your fiber is exposed, and it doesn't take a lot of technology to actually tap into that particular fiber that you can intercept all the communications. More than that is you really don't know when your fiber is being tapped. All it takes is being able to extract maybe 1% of all the light, which is really not detectable if you're actually monitoring the power levels on your fiber, and you have access to all the information that's being carried over that particular fiber. And this is something, like I said, which is fairly easy to do, and your fiber, in many cases, may be even well beyond your particular control in terms of where the bad guys can get access to them. So you might ask yourself the question, well, why does that matter? Why do I need to optically provide optical level encryption or layer 1 encryption, as it's sometimes called, over my fiber or for my fiber traffic? Because I'm going to be doing encryption at a higher level. For instance, I can encrypt my traffic at layer 2 using MAC encryption, layer 3 using IPsec, or for instance, as is commonly being done for most secure web applications, I can actually do the encryption at layer 7, for instance, at the application layer itself using SSL technology, which we're all very familiar with. When we go to a secure website, we see that little lock appearing on the address bar on the upper left. So that's a good question. And the answer really lies in the fact that, like in any type of system, you need multiple layers of security. You have that in your house, you have a front door, you might have an alarm system, people sort of come in through the bedroom window, and you keep your things that are very near and dear to you, like your jewelry and your important papers, perhaps locked up in a safe. So you have multiple layers of security in many different aspects of life, and it makes sense to have that as well within your overall network. For two reasons. First of all, you're not going to necessarily encrypt all your traffic, so that if people are actually accessing and tapping into your optical fiber, what they will be able to do is gain access to all that unencrypted traffic. Maybe you don't think it's important, or maybe you just overlooked encrypting it, but it could damage your business. And the other aspect is that even if you are using higher levels of encryption, you're not protecting all the information. You might be protecting the payloads, but you're certainly not going to be protecting the address information at that particular layer. And by getting access to all this traffic, even just the address information, you're providing a lot of information about your network. People can develop network maps in terms of what your network looks like. They can find out who is talking to who and with what frequency. And then this kind of information can be used as a basis to launch more sophisticated, higher level attacks. So this is one of the reasons that you would want to use layer 1 optical encryption. The other aspect to this is it doesn't really cost you that much. Perhaps, and there certainly are certain costs associated with that feature, but there's no costs associated with an impact on the performance of your network. So the way optical encryption works is at wire speed. In other words, it takes the OTN bit stream and it encrypts it with a session key. In the case of ECI, we use the highest level of the advanced encryption standard with a 256-bit key, which is virtually unbreakable unless you want to be alive 1,000 years from now when you use the kind of computing that you need to be able to decrypt that. It doesn't add any overhead, and it only adds 100 nanoseconds of latency, which is really adding no latency at all. So you can use optical encryption. It adds layers of security to your communications, and it doesn't add any performance. The other aspect of optical encryption, which is one of the more innovations, one of the innovative areas of optical encryption today, is that in the past, when you encrypted your traffic at the layer 1, what you needed to do was encrypt all the traffic simultaneously on a particular wavelength. So in other words, this was really taking place in terms of encryption at the network level. What we're able to do today, and part of the solution that we're offering at ECI, is to encrypt this traffic at the services level. So for instance, you might have various services riding on a particular wavelength. For instance, maybe Ethernet services, fiber channel services, voice services. And what you can do is selectively decide which traffic to encrypt and which traffic not to encrypt. And this provides you a certain degree of flexibility, particularly if you're serving different customers within your NREN network, whether it's on a particular campus or spread across different geographical areas. And depending on how you're charging back to those customers for the services that they need and are willing to pay for, what you can do is very efficiently decide to encrypt certain traffic, not encrypt other traffic, even though they're all being carried on the same wavelength. Another advantage is, as your network becomes more complex, you might start to introduce things such as OTN cross-connects in your network. If you break up this traffic, depending on what's taking place at the cross-connect itself, where you're putting services together in a different way over different wavelengths coming in and out of that cross-connect, if you're encrypting all the traffic simultaneously on a wavelength, that creates all sorts of problems. But if you're encrypting the traffic at the services level, at the ODU level, then this gets carried transparently through the cross-connect itself. So it makes it much easier to administer in a more complex optical network environment. Another aspect towards the administration of your optically encrypted network is, of course, key management. The way that this works is using a public key encryption system, whereby there's private keys for each node, or in the case of service level encryption for each particular service, which goes along with the public key. And what you want to be able to do is distribute those keys and at the same time authenticate that the people using the keys are who they say they are with X509 certification. And what we're able to do is provide you those capabilities in terms of administering this totally in-house within your own network, so that you are not incumbent on any third parties for doing this administration. And this puts you in the position of providing a totally self-managed and secure system for managing optical encryption over your particular network. Just very briefly, the way it works is by using the public key encryption. What you do is you set up sessions between the two endpoints. They certify that they're speaking to each other as needed. And then what they do is that they exchange information to create what's called a session key. And then the session key is used to actually encrypt the traffic that's flowing at wire speed from point to point. So this is a summary, if you like, of what ECI can bring to the table today for optical encryption. We can, if you take a look at the far left, take a very large mix of services and then selectively encrypt these services through your network, giving you the power to administer the encryption yourself. And this could be done, like I said, on a per-service basis, or if you still want to do it on a wavelength basis, it can be done on a wavelength basis as well. And by the way, this can also be applied to any alien wavelengths that you are carrying over your network too, particularly if they're being carried over, of course, in terms of all the traffic being encrypted on that particular wavelength, then the alien traffic gets encrypted as well. So this concludes this part of the presentation in terms of encryption. Hopefully it gave you a little bit of insights in terms of why optical encryption is important and what are some of the innovations taking place over there, particularly in and around per-service encryption, and the fact that this could be administered centrally within your own area network. So let's switch gears, and we're going to talk about a different subject altogether. And then at the end, I can certainly take questions coming back to the encryption subject if that's what people have on their minds. So what we're going to talk about now is monitoring and health management. So why is health management, or why is optical monitoring important in terms of optical networks? So optical networks, sometimes we lose sight of that, is in fact an analog system. And as an analog system, it is susceptible to slow degradation that can often be hard to detect. It could just be due to the lasers falling off in performance in terms of sending signals. There could be degradations taking place within the fiber splices. There could be degradations taking place within the amplification itself. So that you might have engineered your system for a certain level of OSNR performance from day one, but then creeping in over time, you could start to have problems, and this could impact the services that are being carried. You're not getting the kind of performance that you're expecting or paying for with your network. So it's really important to be able to keep your fingers on the pulse of your network, that you can know that you're getting the performance that you are expecting. And as I sort of going back to the first part of the presentation, as you're carrying more and more information and more critical information in your network, this is particularly important. Of course, you also need it for troubleshooting in the case of hard faults occurring, and you need this just in terms of bringing up your network in terms of installation testing and any in-service verification testing when you launch a service for the first time. So it is becoming a much more important part of your overall solution, being able to not just provide services over your optical network, but being able to monitor the health of your optical network. Now, how have we done this in the past? In the past, we relied heavily on human expertise, people that were skilled in managing optical networks, people knew how to use test equipment like optical spectrum analyzers, and it would be a fairly arduous task. What would happen is you would regularly send people out to the different nodes in your network. They would patch in to the various fibers. They would measure the level of service that you're getting on a particular wavelength using the OSA. And this is something which required expertise. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort, and more than that, it took a lot of extra cost for the equipment that you needed. So what we're saying is that there needs to be a better way to do this. And the way that we're proposing, I'm sorry, one more thing before our solution. There's also challenges that you have as your networks are getting more complex in terms of making the kind of measurements that you need. So for instance, when you're dealing with coherent transmissions, such as 100G and now 200G signals, based on the spacing of these particular signals and the filters that are being used to require them, is that if you're using standard OSAs to make these kind of measurements, you could often overestimate the amount of noise that's there. In other words, you would think there's a problem when there's actually not a particular problem. On the other hand, and just the opposite kind of problem can occur if you have ROADMs in your network, where they can, due to the nature of the ROADMs themselves, can cause noise shaping. And what that can do is, if you're using conventional OSAs for measurement, lead to an underestimation of noise level. So in other words, you don't think you have a problem when you actually do. So these are things that you need to be aware of as your optical networks become more complex. So when you put together the various needs that you have to do optical monitoring and how you would face the challenges to do this optical monitoring in terms of having expertise, having to dispatch people, and having to make measurements in more complex environments, the solution that we're bringing to the table at ECI is something that we call Lighthouse. What Lighthouse does is it makes measurements throughout the optical chain on a per wavelength basis, both in the transmitters and at the amplifiers. And what it does is enables you to piece together a picture of the optical performance along the entire optical light path for a variety of measurements, whether it's power, optical signal to noise ratio, chromatic and polarization mode dispersion. And putting this together, what you can do is from a centralized location, get a very sophisticated view of the optical performance of your network. So what it does is it eliminates the need to dispatch people. It provides end-to-end coverage for Apollo as well as alien wavelengths, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then as your networks become more complex, and you may have situations where you need to reroute traffic, perhaps dynamically, what you can now do is you can see the path that you're moving the traffic from to the new path and verify that the new path supports the kind of optical performance that's required for the traffic that you're putting onto it. So the way Lighthouse works, just to reiterate a point that I made before, what it does is it combines measurements with calculations. It makes direct measurements along the entire light path, and then it adds onto that sophisticated algorithms to provide more complex information in terms of other types of measurements. And what this does is, of course, it applies to all the traffic that's being carried natively by Apollo, but also it can support alien wavelengths. So for instance, if you have an ECI Apollo system and you want to carry some alien traffic on top of that, or an alien wavelength on top of that, what we do is we can provide you with what's called a virtual transponder. So the virtual transponder means we're not providing you the light for that alien wavelength, but you can tell us what is the kind of characteristics or performance characteristics that you're expecting from that light, and then you can set that into the system in terms of a virtual transponder. Well, this is the kind of noise level, or this is the kind of power level that it should be at. And then as we can continuously monitor the system over time, you can see if there's changes taking place in that particular power level. The system is also very accurate. We can provide you a lot of supporting information to demonstrate that, to within 1 dB of actually making measurements with sophisticated test equipment. And it takes into account the problems that I mentioned before in terms of making measurements in coherent transmission and ROADM network environments. So here is a sampling of some of the kind of measurements that you could see taking place all along the optical trails. So you could see OSNR, you can see power, you can see chromatic dispersion. And one of the really nice features is that it maintains a record of these types of measurements on a weekly, monthly basis, I believe up to a year, or perhaps this could be extended, so that you can now, when you're making a measurement, you can compare this to historical measurements and see if changes are taking place, and then you can analyze your network in terms of where there might be problems developing, that you can start to take proactive steps before they become real problems. There's actually modules that we're introducing next month, which goes even further in terms of this kind of analysis, which is saying that you're starting to see, for instance, OSNR degradation. It can now analyze in more detail where that is taking place, and where the contributions might be, perhaps from different parts of your network in terms of, say, amplifiers or on the transmit side itself, and then you could start to take more specific proactive steps rather than just take a blanket approach towards fixing those particular problems. So we're providing you a very, very powerful tool for monitoring the health of your network and for being able to pinpoint where the problems are, that you can take the steps to fix things as quickly as possible. Sometimes, by the way, problems don't take place within the transmission path within the fiber. Sometimes problems take place at the level of the fiber itself. These are often caused by hard fiber breaks, or maybe the fiber undergoes some stress, or maybe there's some stress to some of the splices that take place within the fiber. And this could certainly be the case whether you're providing the actual fiber plant or you're using a third-party provider for that. When there are problems with respect to a fiber, one of the things that you want to very quickly be able to do is pinpoint where those problems are taking place. So this is an additional feature that we're providing as part of Lighthouse, what's called OTDR, Optical Time Domain Reflectometry. And what you can see is the screen on the left-hand side showing the kinds of signals that you would get when you're making these measurements across a fiber in terms of how the signals would look like and what are the various causes of the kinds of images that take place based on various kinds of connections and splices, or just overall fiber loss over long distances that would be taking place, that you could see where problems are in that particular fiber. We also link this to a geographic information system, so that if you know your fiber run, based on the distances that are taking place along the fiber that you would get on the screen on the left, these can then get mapped onto the geographic information system, which is would be able to pinpoint to you where those problems are taking place in the real world. For instance, where you would either need to dig or go down a manhole or go to some basement to really address that particular fiber problem. So, putting this all together, and I'll summarize right now, optical networks are becoming a much more important part of your overall infrastructure. It used to be that they were just the dumb pipes. But these dumb pipes are providing more and more information, and they're becoming a lot less dumb. They're becoming much more flexible in terms of providing wavelength services themselves. And they're an important part of being able to provide a more sophisticated services environment to your end customers. And this is particularly the case as we start to put together networks where we're optimizing between the packet layers and the optical layers, that you can get more bang for your buck in terms of looking at the network as a combined whole rather than as just parts by themselves. You also need to have the capability, if you do lose certain optical capabilities, to restore services quickly and dynamically. So to do all these things in a more sophisticated environment, what you also need is a much more sophisticated ability to monitor the health of your fiber and the traffic going over this particular fiber. And this is something which we can do extremely well with ECI's Lighthouse optical health monitoring system. So on that, I will conclude my presentation, and I would be very happy to take questions. You can type them out. So Ian, I don't see any questions forthcoming.
At this moment in time, I think I agree with you. I think you've given everybody such information as they are totally satisfied. However, knowing our group, I think this will this will change, and during the course of the afternoon, I'm sure somebody will be emailing you a few questions, Jonathan. So please don't disappear too quickly. I think that's been a really interesting webinar. Thank you very much indeed. If there are no more questions, I will close the recording, and we'll let everybody get back to other stuff and think about the implications of the ECI information we've just been given. Thanks very much, Jonathan. If you want to give me a ring in a little while, we'll can have a quick chat if you wish. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending.
Thank you all.